A man took care of a sick bear. What happened on his deathbed was beyond words. The wind howled through the snow-covered peaks of Alaska, sending icy gusts through the dense pine forest. Night had fallen, wrapping the land in a deep, unsettling silence. At the edge of a frozen river, nestled among the towering evergreens, stood a small, weathered cabin. Smoke curled from its chimney, fighting against the bitter cold. Inside, Daniel Graves sat by the crackling fire, alone, just as he had been for the past 20 years. The once celebrated wildlife ranger had left civilization behind, retreating into the wild after a loss he could never recover from. His only company was the untamed wilderness, the whispers of the wind, the distant howls of wolves, and the occasional presence of a passing bear. Daniel took a slow sip of his black coffee, staring into the flames. Something about tonight felt different. There was a heaviness in the air, a strange stillness. Then, a low, agonizing sound echoed from the forest. Daniel stiffened. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal's usual call. It was a cry for help. He stood, grabbed his rifle, not to harm, but to protect, and stepped out into the storm. This night would change his life forever. Daniel braced himself against the cutting wind as he stepped out of his cabin, gripping his rifle firmly. The snow crunched beneath his boots, the frost biting through the heavy fabric of his coat. The wind was merciless, howling through the trees, carrying with it a sound that sent a chill down his spine, the cry of an animal in distress. Daniel had spent decades in the wild. He knew the sounds of the forest, the calls of creatures, the rhythm of nature. This wasn't normal. He moved carefully, following the noise, his breath forming clouds in the freezing air. Every instinct told him that whatever he was about to find wouldn't be good. Then, through the thick cover of trees, he saw it. Lying in a half-frozen heap, covered in a dusting of snow, was a massive grizzly bear. Daniel's heart pounded. It wasn't moving. A bear that shouldn't be here. His first thought was simple: this is wrong. Grizzlies should be deep in hibernation this time of year, nestled in dens, hidden away from the brutal cold. So why was this one out here, dying in the snow? Daniel stepped closer, his boots sinking slightly into the fresh powder. The bear's massive body rose and fell in weak, ragged breaths. It was alive, but barely. As he circled it cautiously, his flashlight revealed deep wounds along its flank, a mixture of frozen blood and matted fur. Its ribs were visible beneath its thick coat, its body unnaturally thin. The bear had been starving, wounded, and exposed to the elements for far too long. Daniel's grip tightened on his rifle. A wounded bear was unpredictable, even on the brink of death. If it woke up and panicked, it could be the end of him. But even as logic screamed at him to turn back, to let nature take its course, something in him wouldn't let him walk away. He had seen this look before, not on a bear, but on people. On his wife. The same helplessness. The same slow, labored breaths. The same fight against an enemy too strong to overcome. His jaw clenched. Not again. The dilemma: risk everything or walk away. Daniel took a slow, steady breath. What the hell was he supposed to do? Leaving it out here meant certain death. But trying to help a half-conscious grizzly bear? That was suicide. He looked around, scanning the area for any sign of what had happened. No traps, no hunters, no signs of a fight. The bear had simply collapsed here, alone. That realization made something deep inside him ache. Daniel had spent years in isolation, believing he was better off alone. But this bear? It hadn't chosen this. It had fought. It had tried to survive. And now, it was losing, just like his wife had. He shut his eyes for a moment. He had failed to save her. He had been powerless. But this was different. He could do something this time. The storm howled around him as if daring him to turn back. Instead, he made his decision. "I must be out of my damn mind," he muttered. Then, with slow, deliberate movements, he slung his rifle over his back and knelt beside the dying bear. A dangerous rescue. Up close, the bear's size was even more intimidating. Its massive paws were bigger than Daniel's head. Its breath, though weak, came in deep rumbles. Daniel pulled off his gloves, feeling the bitter cold bite at his skin as he carefully pressed his hand against its chest. A heartbeat, faint, but there. "You're still in this, big guy," Daniel murmured. "Don't quit on me now." First, he needed to stop the bleeding. He reached into his pack, pulling out a canteen of water and a roll of gauze. As he worked, the bear let out a low, guttural groan, its body tensing. Daniel froze. If the bear woke up now, he wouldn't stand a chance. He held his breath. Slowly, the bear's body relaxed again. It was too weak to fight. Daniel worked fast, cleaning the wounds as best he could with what little he had. The gash along its flank was nasty, claw marks, likely from another bear. "This wasn't just starvation," he muttered. "You fought for your life." That made Daniel respect the animal even more. But respect wouldn't keep it alive. It couldn't stay here in the open. Daniel glanced toward his cabin. If he could just get it inside, out of the storm. The idea was insane. Dragging a 600-pound grizzly bear through the snow alone. But he had no other choice. With shaking hands, he pulled out a thick rope from his pack. He carefully looped it around the bear's front legs and shoulders, making a crude harness. Then, he started pulling. It was like trying to move a mountain. Every step was a battle. His legs burned. His breath came in ragged gasps. The storm pounded against him, as if mocking his effort. But step by step, foot by foot, he kept going. He had failed before. He had let the most important person in his life slip away. Not this time. After what felt like an eternity, the outline of his cabin came into view. With one last desperate pull, he dragged the bear up onto the porch, collapsing against the wooden railing. His muscles screamed in protest. His lungs burned. But he had done it. He had saved it. Daniel wasted no time. He stoked the fire, raising the heat inside the cabin. He pulled down extra blankets, laying them over the bear's massive body, trying to stop it from slipping deeper into shock. The bear barely stirred, its breaths uneven. Daniel sat beside it, rubbing warmth into his frozen fingers. "Don't you die on me now," he murmured. He had risked everything to get it here. And now, all he could do was wait. As the blizzard raged outside, Daniel watched over the bear, its chest rising and falling in slow, unsteady movements. Would it make it through the night? Would he wake up to a cabin torn apart by a fully recovered grizzly? Or worse, would he wake up to silence? He didn't know. But for the first time in years, he felt like he was fighting for something again. Daniel sat near the fire, his hands gripping his knees, staring at the massive, unconscious bear lying on his cabin floor. The storm outside continued to rage, slamming icy wind against the wooden walls. But inside, the real battle was being fought. With every passing second, the storm grew fiercer. The temperature dropped rapidly, each breath Jack took visible in the cold air, crystallizing before his eyes. The wind had transformed into a roaring force, whipping around him mercilessly. The snow, already thick on the ground, began to fall harder, blurring everything in sight. The storm wasn't just a threat, it was becoming a life-or-death situation. Jack knew the risks of the wilderness better than anyone. He'd faced snowstorms like this before and had learned to never underestimate the power of nature. But today, this storm was more than just another harsh weather front. It was a brutal, unforgiving force, one that could easily overwhelm him if he didn't make a quick decision. The cub shifted slightly in his arms, its tiny form limp from exhaustion. Jack's eyes widened with panic. He couldn't wait for the bear mother to decide his fate. He needed to act, and fast. The cub's shallow breaths told him all he needed to know. This was a race against time, and the storm wasn't the only enemy he had to face. Jack took a deep breath and turned back toward the cabin, taking a step forward. But then another growl, louder this time, pierced the air. His heart pounded as his eyes flicked toward the bear mother emerging from the fog with terrifying precision. Her massive form was now visible, standing at the edge of the tree line, eyes locked on Jack with an intensity that sent a chill deep into his core. She wasn't just angry, she was desperate. The fear in the bear's eyes mirrored the desperation of the cub in Jack's arms. She must have known that her cub had been taken. The protective instinct surging within her was primal, unyielding. Jack knew that no matter how much he wanted to help the cub, the risk of angering the mother could be fatal. In that moment, he understood the weight of his decision. The storm howled, and the winds picked up, pushing the snow into Jack's face like sharp needles. It was as if the very elements were conspiring against him, amplifying the tension in the air. The ground beneath him was slick with ice, his footing uncertain, yet the urgency of the situation kept him moving forward. The bear mother was closing the gap. Jack could hear the heavy thud of her footsteps, the crunch of snow beneath her massive paws. His breath caught in his throat as he stood still, the weight of the cub in his arms pulling him down. What could he do? What should he do? He glanced at the bear, noting the deep scratches on her fur, the visible exhaustion in her stride. She had been traveling through the storm for hours, perhaps even days, searching for her cub. But that didn't matter. She had found him, and now Jack was standing between them. The cub whimpered again, the sound a sharp reminder of why he was here. He had to get the cub to safety, but how? The danger of the bear's wrath, coupled with the storm's fury, was overwhelming. Jack's heart raced as he weighed his options. If he stayed here, there was no way he could outrun the mother or the storm. If he tried to make it back to the cabin, the mother would surely pursue, and the cub wouldn't survive another minute in these harsh conditions. The internal battle raged inside Jack, but in the end, there was no question about what he had to do. He couldn't abandon the cub. He had to fight for its survival, no matter the cost. Jack adjusted his grip on the cub, clutching it tightly against his chest as he began to move toward the cabin. Each step felt like a struggle, the snow now thick enough to slow him down. His eyes never left the bear mother, who had halted just a few yards away. Her eyes bore into him as if calculating her next move. Jack's breath came in ragged gasps, the cold air stinging his lungs. The storm was no longer just a natural force, it was a battleground. And at its center was the desperate, fragile life in Jack's arms. His pulse pounded in his ears as he stood frozen in the snow, the cub still trembling in his arms. The bear mother's fiery gaze remained fixed on him with unrelenting intensity. His breath came in shallow gasps, his thoughts a tangled mess of fear, compassion, and doubt. The storm raged around him, biting into his skin, the snow now blurring everything into a swirling white haze. The only thing he could clearly see was the mother bear, the embodiment of raw, desperate power, and the tiny creature in his arms, barely clinging to life. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing on him, the weight of a decision that would define the next few minutes or the rest of his life. The bear mother's growl rumbled through the air again, louder now, like a warning shot. The hairs on the back of Jack's neck stood on end, every instinct in his body screaming at him to turn back, to leave the cub and get out of the line of fire. But his heart refused to listen. What am I supposed to do? The question echoed in Jack's mind, an unrelenting presence. He had come to know the wilderness well, its rules, its dangers, its unforgiving ways. But never before had he been forced to make a choice like this, a choice between his own safety and the life of an innocent animal. The storm was only getting worse, the winds howling like a beast in the distance. The trees creaked and swayed, their branches groaning under the weight of the snow. Jack couldn't risk going back to the cabin, the bear mother was too close, her eyes locked onto him, waiting for him to make a move. If he tried to run, she would react. He knew that much. She was a mother, and she would protect her cub at any cost. But what if he could save both of them? You're insane, Jack thought, his mind racing in panic. The situation was growing more dire by the second. His hands, numb from the cold, tightened instinctively around the cub. The animal's tiny, fragile body was barely conscious now, its breaths shallow and labored. It was all Jack could do to keep it warm, to keep it alive. His eyes flicked to the bear mother again. Her massive form was barely visible in the storm, but her presence was undeniable. The maternal instinct in her eyes was clear, she was not just angry, she was scared. Desperate. She needed her cub back. And yet, Jack couldn't just hand the cub over. Not now. Not when the animal was so close to death. But how could he keep it safe without provoking the mother? How could he help without making everything worse? Jack's mind was a whirlwind of confusion, the storm and the fear pressing in on him. He could feel the cold seep deeper into his bones. But it wasn't the chill of the weather that rattled him, it was the unrelenting pressure of the decision he had to make. Should he risk his life to save this cub, knowing it could cost him everything? Should he make a break for the cabin, leaving the cub to its fate? But then there was the undeniable truth, the cub was helpless without him. It wouldn't survive. And there was no way Jack could live with that. If I leave it now? Jack's mind faltered as he turned the thought over. He couldn't do it. Not after all the years of protecting animals, of keeping them safe from the dangers of the world. He couldn't let this cub die alone in the wilderness. A surge of determination rose up within him, pushing aside the doubts and fears. He had never been one to back down from a challenge, even when the odds were stacked against him. And this was the biggest challenge of all. Jack's breath hitched as he stared at the bear mother, her eyes still locked onto him. She was so close now, only a few yards away, her massive form shifting with every growl. The storm had blinded him to everything else, but the bear's raw power was all too apparent. If he was going to save the cub, he had to act quickly. There was no time to hesitate. The wind whipped across his face, stinging his skin, but Jack's thoughts narrowed. He had no choice but to act, to find a way to shield the cub from the storm and the mother's wrath. The cabin. Jack's eyes flicked toward the shelter. It was still a short distance away, but the bear mother wouldn't be easy to deter. The only way he could make it to the safety of the cabin was by taking a risk, a dangerous risk, But it was the only option left. I'll have to open the door, he thought of the cabin's heavy wooden door, its creaky hinges. He could lure the bear mother away by offering a safe escape route. If he could get inside and lock the door, the mother might not follow. It was a slim hope, but it was the only chance they had. He took one last look at the cub, now too weak to move on its own. His heart clenched. He couldn't carry the cub the entire way, not with the storm worsening and the bear so close. But he had no other choice. With every ounce of strength, Jack began to walk toward the cabin, each step slow and deliberate. The bear mother growled again, the low rumble sending tremors through the ground. She was getting closer, but Jack didn't dare stop. His fingers felt like ice as he fumbled with the door handle, the tension mounting with every passing second. He had to move fast. She's right behind me, he thought, feeling the hairs on the back of his neck prickle. But the door creaked open just enough for Jack to slip inside. He turned quickly, slamming it shut behind him, his breath coming in jagged gasps as he leaned against the door. The cub was safe inside with him now, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Jack allowed himself to breathe. But as he looked at the cub lying on the floor of the cabin, he realized that the danger hadn't passed, not yet. The mother bear would stop at nothing to find her cub. Jack had made his choice. Now, he had to live with the consequences. The storm raged outside, but Jack knew that whatever came next, he had made the right decision, the only decision he could live with. He had given the cub a chance. Now, it was up to fate to see if they would both survive the storm. The storm raged through the night, howling against the cabin with an intensity that seemed to echo Jack's racing thoughts. The wind pounded relentlessly against the walls, the trees outside swaying under its weight. But inside the cabin, there was a strange stillness, the quiet calm after a storm of choices. Jack's hands trembled as he knelt beside the cub, now resting on a bed of old blankets. The warmth of the fire crackled softly in the corner, but the heat of it didn't quite reach the chill deep in his bones. The cub had fallen into a fitful sleep, its tiny body curled into a ball, still shaking from the trauma. Jack kept a steady hand on its back, his thumb brushing over the soft fur, trying to offer some comfort. He'd managed to get the cub inside just in time, closing the door against the storm and the mother's fury. He didn't know if the bear mother had followed or if she had retreated, but in that moment, it didn't matter. The cub was alive, and that was enough. His mind kept drifting back to the events of the day, to the moment when he had made the decision to step into the unknown, to risk everything for the life of a creature so fragile, so small in the vast wilderness. The guilt that had gnawed at him had slowly faded into a quiet sense of rightness. He had saved a life today, and for that, he felt a deep, unshakable pride. As the hours passed, Jack's fatigue finally began to set in, but he refused to sleep. His thoughts kept drifting to the mother bear. He could picture her in his mind, the way she had stood at the edge of the trees, her eyes wide with fear and protective instinct. Jack had felt that same surge of protectiveness when he saw the cub in his arms. He understood it now on a deeper level. The connection between them was undeniable. The forest, the animals, the storm, they weren't separate from him. They were all part of a greater whole. Jack had always known this in theory, but now he understood it in his very soul. By morning, the storm had passed. The snow had softened, and the clouds parted, revealing a pale blue sky. The air felt clearer now, and Jack stood at the window, watching the world outside. The forest was still, the trees heavy with snow, but calm. Peaceful. And then he heard it, a low growl, a familiar sound. Jack's heart skipped in his chest. He moved quickly to the door, his mind racing. The bear mother had returned. But this time, there was no fury in her eyes. She stood at the edge of the cabin, gazing at him with an unspoken understanding. Her gaze shifted to the window, where the cub lay still asleep, but safe. The tension that had existed between them the day before melted into something more gentle. It wasn't fear or anger anymore. It was recognition. Jack had acted in a way that transcended the instinct of predator and prey, of human and animal. He had offered the cub sanctuary, and now, the mother knew it. The bear mother growled softly again, but it wasn't a threat. It was a final acknowledgement. Jack felt something stir in his chest as he watched her turn and disappear into the forest, her massive form blending into the snow, disappearing as quickly as she had come. In that moment, Jack knew he had made the right decision. The bond between him and the wilderness had deepened, become something more meaningful, more profound. It wasn't about conquering nature or taking control of it. It was about respecting it, understanding it, and sharing the space with the creatures that lived there. Jack returned to the cub, still curled up on the blankets. He placed a hand on its tiny body, feeling the faint rise and fall of its chest. The cub would survive. It would grow strong. It would return to the wild one day. But for now, it was safe. Jack allowed himself to lean back, his muscles sore from the tension of the past hours. He exhaled deeply, feeling the weight of his decision lift from his shoulders. The storm had passed, and with it, something inside him had shifted. The bond between humans and wildlife was one forged in moments of compassion, in moments of courage. It wasn't something that could be quantified or easily explained, but Jack knew that in saving that cub, he had learned something invaluable about the world he had chosen to live in. That kindness in the face of danger was the most human thing of all. As he watched the cub stir, its eyes fluttering open, Jack couldn't help but smile. A quiet satisfaction settled over him. The wilderness had tested him, but he had risen to meet it. And in return, the wild had offered him something rare, a glimpse into the heart of nature's wild beauty and its untold depths. And as the cub blinked up at him, still weak but alive, Jack knew that this was a moment that would stay with him forever, a bond between human and animal that transcended the boundaries of both. The storm had passed, and with it, Jack had found something far more precious than survival. He had found a place in the world where compassion and respect for life mattered above all else. If you were moved by this powerful story of compassion and survival, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and join our growing community. By subscribing, you'll be the first to hear more heartwarming and inspiring wildlife tales that showcase the deep bond between humans and animals. Your engagement makes all the difference. Every like, comment, and share helps us bring more authentic, touching moments like these to life, allowing us to continue sharing the beauty and rawness of the natural world with you. Here on our channel, we believe in telling stories that inspire, uplift, and remind us all of the incredible ways we connect with the creatures we share this planet with. So if you love hearing about real-life rescues, emotional animal journeys, and the untold stories of wildlife survival, make sure you stay with us for more. Thank you for being a part of this journey. Your support truly matters in helping us share these unforgettable moments.